Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show my friend Mike Brock, and we did a marathon episode. I think we're just over 2 hours, 15 minutes, maybe 2:20 on this episode. It was a really, really awesome conversation. Many of you already know who Mike is, but Mike is lead for TBD, which is focused on decentralized protocols under Block, which many of you know, Jack Dorsey's company that runs Square and all of those things as well, a publicly traded company. So we brought Mike on because Mike is such a philosopher, a deep thinker, a promoter of liberal democracy, such cool and interesting writings and thought on technology, on Bitcoin, and all of the above. Mike was also present at one of the crypto roundtables hosted by Ro Khanna and others. So I wanted to get his perspective on the Democrat potential reset on crypto, but you'll find mostly in this conversation, we actually talked about philosophy. We talked about the common good. We talked about interacting with each other in this digital age and hyper-partisan age, and just how we need to be more thoughtful in interacting, how we're so reactionary in this day and age, and just why it's really important to focus on the common good. We had really deep conversations about humanity, about our path forward that I knew we would in this conversation. So I'll let you all get into this, think deeply on this, reflect on this, break it up into sections as well. I know it's a long one. And thank you all for tuning in for this episode. As always, be sure to check out our partner links to get discounts on awesome Bitcoin products that I personally use in the show notes. So check out those in the links below. And if you guys have any questions or want to get in touch with me at all, you can hit us up in our Telegram group, which is our Progressive Bitcoiner Telegram group, where we have all sorts of conversations about things, including episodes. You can hit me up there. And you can also email me at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. All right, everyone, enjoy the conversation, and we'll see you again next week. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, Trey.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm really excited to talk to you. I looked it up. We last spoke in October, like officially on Mike here. And a lot has changed. I mean, I guess just the world we live in, a lot changes, in 6 months.
The last month has felt like a year.
Yeah. I mean, just to go through a rundown of where we're at in the world, since we even spoke and dropped the episode, there's obviously the horrible events of Israel and Palestine with Hamas. There is obviously an election year that I knew would be turbulent. There's stuff with Ukraine still going on. There's economic forces that have been going on, protests in Venezuela that have been going on. So many things going on in our world.
Deeply troubling. And I want to, on the issue of Venezuela, I want to send my heart out to my friends Thor Halverson and Leopoldo Lopez and his wife Lillian Tintori, who are all Venezuelan political exiles, and these people are dear friends of mine, and so I know that they're going through a lot right now with the events in Venezuela, and I want to take this opportunity to send my love to them. And to all of those in Venezuela who seek freedom and justice from this deeply troubling set of events that have unfolded in recent weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. Constantly fights for freedom and democracy and things that, folks that follow our pod, we obviously talk a lot with folks from the Human Rights Foundation, others that have been covering this issue that cover it much better and more specifically and in detail than we would. So many other groups that we're involved with that folks can look into. But there's so much that I wanted to talk to you about. I think folks that do know you, that have been on the show before, I think some of your points in focusing on these ideals. You're a poet, you're a philosopher. I think you pride yourself in that too.
I wouldn't call myself a poet.
I think so. I think so a little bit. Any philosopher is a poet in my book.
I'm not. Yeah, that's one thing. I think my philosophy can kind of be dry sometimes, but I appreciate I appreciate you pumping me up there.
Yeah, well, you're romantic. Maybe that's a term that you say.
I think that's true. I'm a romantic. Yeah. That's I definitely think that.
There you go. So obviously this year, through the Progressive Bitcoiner, we talked quite a bit about Bitcoin, illuminating that to progressives on the left, which we're obviously going to touch on in this show as well, but also being the Progressive Bitcoiner, where a bunch of progressives, left, liberals, that kind of thing. So we focus on liberal democracy. We focus on the election this year and kind of the height of everything. Quite a bit has happened in the past couple of months as well, with Joe Biden deciding to not run for re-election this year, with Kamala Harris stepping up, becoming the presumptive nominee, then becoming the nominee. And also where Bitcoin crypto lies in all of this, some renewed sense of hope from some folks on the left side of the aisle that are really into Bitcoin, to see maybe there's a chance of moving forward on this. The way I view it is moving forward so that we can stop talking about it so much as this like, should it exist, should it not type debate. So there's a lot of that I wanted to get into as well. But since we last talked, maybe we'll kind of start off with you. I know you think deeply on many different things. So I think as of late, to kick things off, what are some of the things that you've been thinking about, just in terms of our world, where we're at, the road ahead? Because I think a lot of, not only we talk about Bitcoin, we talk about technology, we talk about all these things, but so much of it is because we've seen problems in the world and we'd like to fix them. That's what a lot of technologists are. I think that's probably a lot of where your passions lie, and the work that you do with Block is just thinking through there are problems in the world we want to fix. So what are some of the things you've been thinking about recently in terms of the big picture? Since we talked in October, but also just the past couple of months.
Well, I would say that the thing that I think about most deeply when I'm with my own thoughts and I'm not, um, engaged in the daily toil of life, of work, of family, um, and obviously these things all connect at some level. But like when I'm alone with my thoughts, um, the thing that really troubles me is the realization that as humans, I feel like we're in a crisis of meaning, um, as a species. And what I mean by that is that I think we're sort of kind of going through this collective psychic episode, as as humans, as we renegotiate what it is we think it is to be a human in the world where our relationship to it has been increasingly intermediated by the internet, our phones, uh, uh, you know, increasingly, uh, apparently, uh, AI, as an increasing intermediary, of our relationship with the world. And um, I think for me, I worry a lot about the fact that people increasingly seem listless and that they're clearly in search of meaning. And I think to the extent that there is a crisis of meaning, we're seeing that meaning is getting filled with degeneracy of a kind, that is disconnected from notions of uh, a collective generative project of civilization. I think that we live in a culture today where languages like I and me, um, and you and they dominate, our conversation, and there's very little we and us. I think that this is a problem that appears to be getting worse, not better. I think when we talk about political polarization, this is, of course, a manifestation of what I'm talking about. We when we talk about us and they, we're not talking about us as Americans anymore. At least I think I am when I say that. When I say the word us as Americans, I do mean very explicitly to include those who politically disagree with me. I recognize them as my compatriots, in a higher cause of nationhood, that started, you know, um, in a revolution in the 18th century, on this continent. Um, and I think that notion has become increasingly hard for people around the world, and I think it has many causes. Uh, I think that uh, I, I'm not really retreading any new ground here when I say that I think that social media, um, Instagram, Snapchat, the sort of these mediums of self actualization, I think have contributed to a psychology in people that is, I don't, I mean, I'm not, I can't escape the word, but narcissistic. Um, and, uh, and I'm not saying that people are narcissistic. But I am saying that in a sense we've created a culture that rewards narcissism. That the dopamine hits that people get tend to come from narcissistic behavior rather than behavior that is aligned with what I would suggest is um, embodied in concepts that sometimes get described as the greater good or the general welfare, um, or the higher justice, or like any of these uh, philosophical weighty ideas that there is something that's bigger than all of us, and that we contribute to, and that even as we are authors of our own lives, we are nothing. We are only contributing authors to a larger story, and that beyond that, to the extent that I think we've lost a sense of meaning in our situatedness in history, and where we find ourselves, which is on the other side of what I view as a heroic and harrowing history for humanity that started, depending on what scientists you want to believe, began somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, um, probably somewhere in I can't remember the region where the mitochondrial Eve has been believed to have been found, but that we have been a species that has defied odds, defied uh, massive challenges. We almost went extinct, as it turns out, we believe, before we made it out of Africa in a period of expansion of the Saharan desert and collapse of hunting and grazing regions. The human population dwindled to what is believed to have been maybe nothing more than a few tens of thousands. Um, and by some miraculous turn of history, a small group of these people made it out of Africa, began the long process of colonizing the whole rest of the world, um, overcoming amazing challenges, ultimately forming the first cities. Uh, the rise of the division of labor, the agricultural revolution, which for the first time in our existence allowed us to separate intellectual pursuits from the pursuits of mere survival, of subsistence. That brought forth to the world philosophy, ideology, religion, um, and and all of those things that came from that. Um, we existed in a pretty interesting set of historical events through the rise of empires, such as the Roman Empire, uh, and then its vestiges, the Byzantine era that came after it, and obviously we get to the more modern age with the Ottomans and the British Empire, um, and the truth is that um, we've gotten, I think, to a point culturally where we've lost touch with the sacrifices and the stories that came before us, um, and we've lost our ability to see meaning in that, to recognize that our that the fact that we're sitting here today, um, is is a historical contingency on all of those things that I just described. And not only am I sitting here having a conversation with you on a podcast called The Progressive Bitcoiner, um, talking openly and freely about political ideas that some people quite clearly disagree with me vigorously on, and maybe you and I disagree on some things, but that we have a capacity to do that seems downstream of a lot of really important sacrifices by some people who did think that there was something more important than themselves. And they laid their lives down. They sacrificed their careers. They chose to vest in their posterity the 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 products of their struggle and their sacrifice. And I think we've lost touch with that. And I think there's uh, a lot of cynicism about our past, um, disinterest in it. There's a cynicism about it that you hear people say things like America was born in sin. Um, I don't know what that means. I mean, other than to maybe suggest that if we're going to say that, then we were all born in sin to some respects. I was born into this world in 1981, and when I was born, among other things, homosexuality was still illegal in most of the developed world. Um, Sodomy was a crime in many parts of the world. Almost nobody believed in the notion that two gay men or two gay or lesbian women, like the idea that they would come together uh, in a matrimonial institution was like unheard of at the time I was born, and I'm only 44 years old. And so I look at our society, and I look at our country, and I look at the project of liberal democracy as one that has been an outstanding success at permitting the advancement of social justice. Um, and look, I understand that justice delayed is always there's always a sense that that's justice denied. But we have to recognize that fundamentally that what gives us meaning as a society and as a people is that we hold on to that capacity for change, that we hold on to that capacity, that there's this pretense that we can be better than what we are, that there is a standard that we hold ourselves to, and that we can recognize that we're not meeting that standard, and that can upset us, and that can cause us to go into the streets and to protest and to fundraise, and to vote accordingly, and to like recognize that that is deeply meaningful and important. And I feel like most people have lost touch with that, especially in this conversation, quite honestly, around Bitcoin. And it's one of my deep sort of like, I guess, cleavages between, I think, a lot of more libertarian thought and myself. And it serves as a point of departure around how I view Bitcoin as a positive force, and how some others view it as a somewhat more revolutionary force that I think runs in contravention. I think, at least when I try to extrapolate what I think it is they're saying, runs in contravention of those values, and that sort of historicity, and my desire to see a continuance of it um, is. And so, I mean, I don't know. Like, you asked me like what I'm thinking deeply about, and that's probably the most vigorous unpacking I think I've given anybody. And I wasn't expecting to give it here, but now that I have, I guess I'll stop talking and let you do what you're going to do with that.
For me, coming into this conversation, I feel a lot of similarities to you just on conversations we've had, things that you literally will put out into the world, whether it's Medium articles, posts on social media, things like that. And there is a bit of a coming up on an election, coming up on Bitcoin doing its thing, coming up on revolutions around the world, coming up on wars and all of these things. You have to take a step back and think about, how did we get here? Why are we here? What is the sense on social media, on X? Is this part of a larger thread that's very concerning, which I agree with? And I wanted to, out of that context that you mentioned, and I promise people we're going to get to the whole crypto and dem reset and talk about it. I will, but bear with us.
Well, I mean, I think this serves as a good foundation, right?
Yes,
To talk
exactly.
about,
My point being,
to talk about like where Bitcoin fits in. But yeah, I mean, I think like, look, I think that's, look, nobody should, everyone has seen my arguments for Bitcoin. And I think sometimes people think I'm arguing against it because I think people sometimes tie these political notions too closely to
which is the whole thing we stand against through
which
these
I think
efforts
which
here.
I think which I think kind of comes face to face with the notion that I think you're getting at, which is trying to get to a place where these are not considered partisan issues.
Well, I think too, to go deeper with you in that, I'm like, it's more like a lot of my work I find, and I've said this a lot on here, but I say it to people off camera all the time. Like, yes, I historically come from the left. I live in New England. I interact with many progressives. My day job is in nonprofits.
I hear there's a lot of those people in New England.
Yeah. Right. So all of that, right? It's who I am. I grew up in the South. I grew up very conservative evangelical. I still have family there. So coming into Bitcoin, I could understand that world. And I pulled on a lot of threads that I saw very similar to religious fundamentalism with certain movements. And Bitcoin is one of them. There's many other movements that find themselves in this state as well, with certain groups of people, online communities, whatever. But part of my argument too with Bitcoin in this case, with many things, but with Bitcoin, is how do we have something that a lot of us, or hopefully all of us who are very active in this space, feel is a good thing? Like in this case, Bitcoin. Some others, their thing is privacy technology or other technologies or certain movements or political ideas. For Bitcoin, if we think it's a tool for good, my whole argument is, how do we interact with the real world about Bitcoin, not just the citadel online, or not just your particular lifestyle view, or how you're going to build tremendous wealth for yourself and your family? How do we have Bitcoin work today for people, or in the future for people who do believe that things like taxes should exist, who do believe that things like government should exist, right? So some of these things that I hear so often or see so often from people, they talk and then I'm like, listen, you just lost 95% of people with what you were saying. And yes, sure,
Yeah.
I'm a progressive, write me off, whatever. But my goal is like, I actually tease out these things in real life on a day-to-day basis to see if it's only working for 5%, that is a failed project in my mind, regardless of
Yeah.
whether it's Bitcoin or something else. So my thing is, how do we not compromise views and values? Because something like Bitcoin is countercultural. It is revolutionary in some regards. We're building this parallel system because, especially on the left, we come from things like Occupy. We see how Wall Street, banks, some authoritarian regimes around the world.
I mean, computers were
Yes.
considered countercultural in the 1980s.
Sure.
It was like a whole thing around like Apple and Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and like the whole sort of like the personal computer versus like IBM and like
the
like,
1984 ad completely.
I mean, we've been here before. You know, we've been here where
there's a playbook.
And so it's not a new thing that new technologies attract sort of groups of people who want to sort of like use the opportunities or the perceived opportunities that the technology provides for, to explore new possibilities of living together and a conception of like what the good life can be. I think that's normal. But I also think that we need to sort of responsibly look at these things and also be historically literate and recognize that there there does tend to, on occasion, be excess, political and economic excess that can sometimes arise from what you refer to as like these countercultural elements. You say 5% of the population. I think that's probably a reasonable number to attribute to people who I think have a very, very strong anti-authority tendency, and these people tend to gravitate towards ideologies like libertarianism on the right, or left libertarianism on the left, or anarchism. And I think that's like probably right. Uh, I think a good 80% of human beings are relatively tribal. Like I think our tribalism is burnt into our DNA as much as we might want to run away from it. um, I think our tribalism is both a blessing and a curse. It's a beautiful thing in some ways. The idea of having a tribe, which you could also describe as community, um, and and within that community, I think that is the place, our tribe, if you will, our most closest tribe, our family, and the extended family, and the community. I think most people, when they sit down and think about what gives their lives meaning, is embedded in those conversations. And there is a group of people that I think exist in every generation. They tend to be, as Steve Jobs, I think, described in his famous ad when he came back to Apple in the '90s, the misfits, the ones who don't fit in, the ones who change things because they want to challenge the status quo. And those people are important. They are
Mhm.
important for moving society forward because they do challenge us, and they do require us to think about, like, why is it that we are so sure that this liberal democracy thing is all it's cracked up to be. I mean, I actually think that as somebody who believes in this, I'm not one of those people that thinks this is beyond debate. I think we should talk about it. We should talk about why these things are important. We should evaluate very carefully those in Bitcoin and outside of Bitcoin. Uh, the ideas of, say, that I understand to be popular uh, cult favorite opinions of Curtis Yarvin and Hans Hermann Hoppe, and these individuals who exist in these sort of dark Enlightenment ideas of questioning, maybe we should have somewhat more of top down authority in our country. That maybe we should be a monarchy. Maybe dictatorship isn't so bad. China is able to build high speed rail in months, and it takes us 20 years. Maybe there is something about democracy that is failing us. I think this is fine, and I obviously disagree very strongly with these notions. But I would say that for people on our side of the fence, I would suggest to people that, like, for this 5% that you mentioned, that are making really, really large and noisy noises about these things, that I think we should have reasonably thoughtful answers as to why. Why is it that it's okay that we don't aren't able to build high speed rail in 6 months, the way that happens in other parts of the world, because there are less legal rights and there are less due process rights, and because the government's authority can supervene any private interest with reckless abandon. We've chosen not to live in a country like that, where we have to balance those interests. I think that's a good thing, and but I also think that it's fair. It's fair to have to defend those ideas, and I'm not one of those people that just like uh, will run away from these things. And it's why, through that frame, I spend quite a bit of time in my free time trying to think about, like, why is it? why is it that we believe in liberal democracy so much? I think that story should be told again,
Mm.
and it needs to be told. And that basically comes full circle back from what I said at the top of this around our crisis of meaning, because I think that if we want to have liberal democracy, if we want and a Bitcoin to be embedded in that democracy, then there's some really important storytelling that has to happen here about like why it is we're doing it that way, to answer the questions that you're getting at, which is like, why should government have taxation? Why is it like why should I have to hand over my Bitcoin to the government to pay for their wars that I don't agree with, or their social programs that go against my religious convictions, or whatever argument you might have, that there's some sort of that you have some sort of moral charge as to not be required to contribute to society, um, uh, through some frame that your individual notions of self-actualization are what are most important. I don't think that that's a sustainable stance for society. Um, but I do think that their challenge needs answers, and so I do try to take the time to thoughtfully answer those questions.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about for everyone listening. That's a lot to think about and talk about. Yeah, I think in terms of mentioning Bitcoin, mentioning history, context, I think also with because there's so many different angles to approach something like Bitcoin, but let's say in kind of a history life cycle of this new phenomenon, it's 15 years old, this experiment, right? And one of the things that I'm really adamant about personally, our whole platform really is about having this assimilates the wrong word and is very has connotations to it, but how do we have Bitcoin butt up against problems that exist, the reason for its creation in a lot of ways? And sure, people can debate the reasons, but clearly it was kind of birthed out of this long battle for a better e-cash that actually worked and solved some problems. In addition to global recession and financial crisis, and central banks having quite a lot of power that punished a lot of people or corporations or
Mhm.
whatever, what have you. But at this point, even that aside, it is this open source protocol. It's a tool that a lot of people are going to use. A lot of people say Bitcoin is for enemies. Anyone on earth can use Bitcoin just as anyone on earth can use the
My friend,
internet
my
or a
friend, my
VPN.
friend, my friend Andrew Bailey is fond of that
Yeah, yeah,
of
exactly.
that turn of
Well, that was
phrase.
the first. Was it the first line in Resistance Money, their book? I believe it was.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's great.
Bitcoin is for enemies. Yeah,
It's my favorite book on Bitcoin, bar
same,
none.
same.
I love that book so much. I recommended it to everybody. Whether you hate Bitcoin or not. It's funny when they basically say there's something in there for everybody. They really mean it. It's such an
Hmm.
amazingly intellectually honest take on things.
Yeah, and we've talked about it so much on this show. I mean, we did an episode a couple of months ago with Brad from the group. I'm regularly in communication with these guys, just sussing out ideas because I think they're all brilliant. But yeah, in the life cycle of where Bitcoin's at now, my point being, and kind of maybe entering into a bit of a practical situation on we're at a point where the game theory, the whatever of Bitcoin you'd like to say, is coming a bit to a head in
Yeah.
terms of politicians, governments, world governments. We're going to focus for a bit just on the US specifically, but kind of our platform trying to encourage Bitcoin to not be this nonpartisan thing that first, whether you agree or not, or some people say it has to be this way, it kind of goes through this super partisan period. And then do things come to a head and do really hard things get decided? Like hard
Mhm.
things security wise from the US government saying Bitcoin is good or bad, yes or no, up or
Yeah.
down. I'm not saying it'll get to that point, but these are some questions that might be surfacing. And right now, things are coming a bit to a head. I mean, we have Donald Trump, US political candidate, presidential candidate, talking about Bitcoin very openly, saying, I will do this with Bitcoin. I will have it as a reserve asset, all of these things, whether it's pandering, whatever it case would be. I believe it's pandering, but people will say politicians always pander. So, yes, I understand. Either way, it's at that point in its life cycle currently. It's at a point where many Democrats are trying to court with their voters, with grassroots groups, with others to try to have Democrats have some sort of position on it. It's entered into this partisan politics. And I believe many have tried to shrug off the responsibility of dealing with Bitcoin and crypto and this thing, hoping that it might go away. I think some people, to the point where they're like, okay, it's not really going away, right? Even an interesting conversation I had with Roger Huang, who wrote a brilliant book, Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? Had him on recently, and an interesting conversation about government, wherein he this was his opinion, but he basically was like, yeah, I think even Chinese government officials were a little surprised that that Bitcoin kept going at the rate it has after their mining ban, after all these other things where there's a dip in the hash rate for like 2.5, 3 months, and then roaring back again. So I think a lot of sophisticated governments, and I would say the Chinese Communist Party is very sophisticated. They're very smart. They know what Bitcoin is. I truly think they're one of the few governments, they really understand. And there's different factions are fighting it quite a bit, right? So my
Yeah.
point being, a lot of government officials are seeing, understanding. I think the US, especially intelligence agencies, they have smart people working. They see that this thing exists. So how are we going to utilize it? How are we going to be pro it? How are we going to be against it? In what ways? And that's coming to a head. And I wanted to get your take on it. Obviously, you had even posted out, you were even listed, I think, from Rokana being a part of these crypto roundtables, or at least one. I think there was another one recently. I believe you were part of the first one. I'm not sure
I was part of the first. I was part of the second.
You were part of the second, not the first.
I was not part of the second. I was part of the
Got
first.
it. Okay. Yes. So the first was back in July. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes. So from just your thoughts around that, what do you think about the point of US political history that Bitcoin finds itself in, and beginning a conversation here about a reset, a crypto reset, whatever have you? But just wanted to get your pulse check on those experiences that you've had very personally.
I've never really thought that there was a reasonable risk that Bitcoin or crypto more generally was going to see anything in the U.S. resembling a ban.
Mm.
Um, uh, I, I think that the real risk, I think, is and has remained, and I think will remain, the risk of bad regulation and bad laws. Um, my sense, my honest sense, my most charitable one, is that I think there's a major generational divide in Washington as it pertains to my views of the Democratic Party and how they line up on this. I mean, I happen to view, based on my own personal conversations, and I've had the chance to sit down with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who's a senator on the Democratic side, who is obviously very pro Bitcoin and very like pro this stuff. Rokana, you mentioned, who I was invited to his roundtable, is a major advocate of these things. I think there is a generational thing here. I just think it has to be said, that there is, if you want to call it, an old guard of people who, many of them don't even have email. Like the idea that they're gonna, like, Bitcoin is gonna be described to them in a way that like makes sense to them, is probably too tall an order. But I think it's like pretty consistent when you talk to younger lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, that there is an understanding of, I think, of a few things, and I think these things have always sort of like given me like hope that it's not likely that we were ever going to see something like Congress actually passing the Bitcoin Ban Act or something insane like that, or some sort of executive order tantamount to gold confiscation, which a lot of libertarian type people are worried about, would occur, because it's always seemed to me that even in the most skeptical corners of official Washington, that there do seem to be sort of bracing concerns about competitiveness worry that they could be wrong. And if they're wrong about those things and these technologies were to turn out to be very important to the economy, that America could push these innovations offshore, and that would be bad for American competitiveness. And I know that this worries people in Washington, even those who are deeply skeptical of Bitcoin, and even as they might be inclined to walk out a parade of horribles about Bitcoin, like all the terrible things that people can possibly do with it that you can possibly imagine. I think even they recognize that there's probably something unwise about like trying to shut this thing down for no other reason than they sense it would be deeply unpopular, or it would leave American competitiveness in question. And three, because I mean, I think there's in some cases, these people do recognize that they don't understand it, and their opinions aren't as strong as some people on the outside might think that they are. I don't know this to be the case, but like I would be very surprised if Joe Biden had anything resembling an opinion on Bitcoin at all.
Mm-hmm.
And people want to make jokes there, one way or the other. Whether how cognitively with it you think he is or not, I don't. I think that statement would be true regardless, and I think that that's a generational thing. I don't think that many people of that age and that generation are going to necessarily be well equipped to understand the nuances of these things. Like, how could they? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's like and so I think that people can whip themselves up into a frenzy about thinking that like disaster is upon us, that like that the government has some nefarious plans and a multi-agency process to snuff out Bitcoin uh, or technologies like it through choking it off through strategic regulations. I think the reality is somewhat more nuanced. I think that these people in Washington, uh, many of them are charged with certain responsibilities. If your job as a in the administration is charged with overseeing the enforcement of laws to combat financial crimes, you know, you're probably going to be quite worried about the ways in which criminal activity can be interdicted, investigated, and brought to justice with these technologies. And when libertarians hear that, obviously that upsets them because there's this sense of like, well, the government having that power is too dangerous. We have to think about the danger to liberty and the principles of Bitcoin. Like enforcement of the law can't like supersede our sort of sovereign rights as humans, and we get into these like weird arguments. And I kind of think these are really, I mean, I hate to say it, kind of sometimes
Mm-hmm.
immature takes. Like you live in a society, and in that society, there are things that represent antisocial behaviors that are contrary to our collective interests. I don't think fraud is in the interests of society at large to be permitted to go unchallenged. I don't think that. I think Sam Bankman-Fried was very justifiably brought to justice for conducting a humongous fraud that hurt millions of people. Um, uh, and to the extent that skeptics of Bitcoin and technologies like it would point at something like that and say to people like you and me, um, like, what are you telling us about how it is we're supposed to go about doing our jobs? as enforcers of laws, and we are a nation of laws. I hope people believe that, are to go about preventing millions more people being taken advantage of. And if you're going to sit here and tell me that any regulation is bad regulation, I think that people in our position are not going to be seen as terribly credible,
Mhm.
because these are reasonable, equitable concerns for those who have an interest in uh, the protection of our common interests as a society would have. Now, some people might respond there again with a charge that, well, these agencies that you speak of, Mike, that are charged with this are deeply corrupt and they're part of the deep state or XYZ thing, whatever. And we can kind of like just like tie ourselves up into stitches about the moral legitimacy of these things. But I would just come back to the fact that these are reasonable concerns for reasonable people, and they need to be talked about, if we are going to live in a society that has rule of law. Because I don't think that like it should be. I want to be very clear. I don't think the Wild West um, is in any of our interests. I think it's a good thing, for example, that we have securities laws. Why do I say that? Well, because if I can just sell shares on the stock exchange for a prospectus for a company that I just completely made up, and there's no way for anybody to evaluate whether or not it's true that I have as much money as I say I do, that my accountants are as trustworthy as I say they are, that I don't think it's unreasonable in a society to have an agency, a securities uh, uh, law enforcer that says, hold on a second. We would like to check your books and we'd like to see that that money is actually in your accounts. And we would like to evaluate whether these things that you're telling investors are actually true. Because if you don't do that, then frauds such as that, which we saw with FTX and Sam Bankman Fried, are going to be quite easy to pull off over and over and over again. And I don't think it's reasonable for the answer to be, well, everyone just has to take personal responsibility for doing their own diligence. Say that
Mhm.
to a single mother who's taking care of three kids, and working two jobs, who's trying to get ahead, and maybe she wants to invest a little bit of money and some stock, here and then, to basically put money away for her kids' future. And our response is, well, you just need to do your own research, because having these having these laws and these regulators are just like a bridge too far and go against some sort of sacred principle of like individual rights and things like that. These aren't reasonable takes. Like if you sit down and actually think about it.
Agreed. And if you, and by the way, one of the people that would agree with what you just said the most, ironically, and I know many Bitcoiners that are fan, but many are, Elon Musk. Elon Musk has said regularly. So a new, I guess he's found himself some champion of freedom of speech, which is hilarious and false, and champion of the right all of a sudden, contradicting many things he said even 2 years ago. But he's a huge fan of regulatory environments for safety and for space. And when he's talked about AI and Tesla and all these things, he's on record being one of the biggest advocates for regulation for things like this, regardless of, I guess, what's going on in the world now. But also
He
my
has certainly advocated for AI safety in the past, anyways.
right, I know, but let me check. It depends on the week, I guess, at this point. Well, I will say too, if because as I've started to talk with more people in the space, and I've been getting a lot of great advice, and I won't mention them by name, but some of the people in the space in Bitcoin doing really great work, been really getting a lot of great advice this past year. when I've kind of questioned, do I keep doing this? What is this on about? Like, I'm just running this little podcast. I'm getting a lot of hate. Is it worth it? All of this stuff. And a lot of people I've been talking to have gotten moved more to a more comfortable place of ignoring a lot of this noise that we're talking about of some people that we feel are so influential and loud online, or so this or so that, right? Ignoring that, I'm talking with people that aren't as loud online, but are in communication regularly with real people, real city councils, real states, real congressional members of Congress about this, and doing really incredible work behind the scenes so that we can get up to a place where people are freely using Bitcoin, where people are understanding that Bitcoin can be this thing for them that is great in their pension or payments, like getting to a place where it's more readily available as payments, or not taxed under $200, right? These proposals that I'm personally a big proponent and fan of, but people that are interacting in the real world, saying, how can we use this technology for the real world? And learning that so many other people espousing views that you were mentioning are not connected in those ways, are not, but then they'll say that's co-option, all of this stuff. Sure. So I've gotten to a really good place where, understanding that, I'm less in a position where I'd like to espouse views that, because like you said, a lot of these takes are very reasonable. Like, some members of Congress, not all, but some, are asking these questions in good faith, right? How do we know that SBF won't happen again, like FTX and the blow up? And it's not enough to just say, well, those are shit coins. That doesn't answer their question. You can't just say fuck you to a politician if they don't understand something.
Yeah, I
Everyone
mean
takes education.
that's yeah, I mean I think that's like, and that's related to a point I said earlier, right? Like, if I mean I said it about liberal democracy, but I'll say it about Bitcoin now. Yeah, you better like be willing to like address serious questions about serious things and have a compelling answer for them. That's not just some hand wavy notions about
Mhm.
like your individual rights or something. Um, I mean, I I hope people recognize that they're beating a dead horse when they do that. And if they're not, then I think their lives might be being lived a little bit too online, and that some of these people might want to take their own advice and touch grass. Um, but I mean, like,
Mhm.
because these are these are reasonable things to talk about. If I'm and I've sat in rooms in Washington D.C. with some of these people, and I've tried to have reasonable, open discussions with them about their deep concerns. I have sat across. I'm not gonna. I don't want to name names, but I've sat across the table from politicians on both sides of the aisle, quite frankly. And believe it or not, like, there are people on the Republican side that I've sat with who are skeptical of these things too, through the lens of national security and worries around like evasion of sanctions by regimes such as that of Vladimir Putin's in Russia. Um, and so when these things come up, um, the answer just can't simply be, well, we can't address those problems because individual rights just matter too much, so we're just going to have to deal with it. That is not, like, you say that to them and then they start thinking, first of all, they don't think you're very credible on the issue anymore, because you've just basically told them that something that is deeply worrying to them is a bullshit issue and is subservient to whatever I think about what I should be entitled to in the world. Getting back to this I versus, this conception of us and we, and a broader conception, is not a serious way to engage on these issues. And I would suggest to anybody who's worried about the future of Bitcoin, in this conversation around laws and regulations, um, one, to stop freaking out for a second here. Everything's not as bad as you think. No one's actually like contemplating banning it. yes, like there is a risk of bad regulation. Yes, the regulatory landscape is uncertain right now. Yes, there is a very frustrating problem of regulation through enforcement that we're seeing. And that is a view that I have expressed in that roundtable that you mentioned before, uh, about how troubling it is that um, companies and actors within the space simply do not know how to comply with the regulations because the regulators won't tell them, and then of course they find themselves um, having to respond to enforcement action, which feels deeply unfair. Now we can look at some of these cases and we can debate whether or not the law was conceivable on an a priori basis in these cases, and I think there's arguments to be made that some of these things are some of these people might have recognized that what they were doing was was probably illegal, and they did it anyways. And I think in other cases, I think the example seems kind of unfair on the surface, and so I think that this is a very nuanced story, and I think my charge to people is that uh, these are real concerns by real people. I think some of them deeply care about this country, and they deeply care about their portfolios, and I think that for those in the national security establishment that are worried about things like sanctions evasion, I believe these people to be deeply worried about America's national interests, and how they're being challenged by malign foreign adversaries that seek to um, uh, undermine our security and the security of our allies and our friends around the world, and that their interests appear to be very much aligned with the idea of challenging, if not outright bringing about the end of our democratic way of life, and that these people might ask questions about what happens if these technologies are used to funnel these individuals' resources that will then be used against us. That's a fair question of to ask, and I think that a lot of Bitcoiners who just throw their hands up and say it's too dangerous, it's a slippery slope to even entertain the notion that we could stand in the way of such a thing, I think is a very irresponsible stance. If for no other reason is it makes you look bad because you're not treating the issue as serious, and it is a serious issue, at least for those of us who care about such things, and I would count myself in that group of people. Um, that these are things that need to be discussed. I do think, just for the record, if anyone is under any disillusionment, I think if a court order were to come down, a warrant demanding that I hand over my private keys to in a court of law, I think I would probably have a legal obligation to do so, because I just like I would be legally required to hand over anything else, in within the due process of law. I think that I am entitled to my innocence. I think I am entitled to get those assets back if a jury of my peers decides it so, or an appellate court, or ultimately the Supreme Court decides that. But I accept the premise that I live in a society where ultimately my connection to my property and to my possessions is certainly contingent upon my willingness to follow the same laws as everyone else. And that shouldn't really be a radical notion, because that hasn't been at issue for almost anything else before. I mean, you can argue that there's these gold bugs and tax revolters and stuff like that throughout history that have tried to make this argument in different contexts. But this idea that, like in Bitcoin, that the government could ask me for my private key. Well, I mean, and obviously you don't have to hand it over, but like, do if you are a modern day Al Capone and you had murdered people and engaged in massive illegal activity that brought suffering and misery upon your fellow citizens. And the only way in which the government was able to bring charges against you, as they did in the case of Mr. Capone, was to bring tax evasion charges against him for his failure to pay his taxes. And that were to be how somebody holding Bitcoin up against such criminal and antisocial pursuits were to refuse to hand over their private keys when a jury of their peers deemed that they were not that those were the proceeds of crime, or maybe they were stolen from other people and should justifiably be returned to those people. So yes, you should give up your private keys so we can give the Bitcoin back to the people you stole it from. These are like pretty pedestrian understandings of like the social contract in which we live. And I don't recognize the sort of the vigor with which some people think that that's not true.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. I think what we're talking about, and hopefully, people sticking through this episode and continuing to, these are really, really important conversations to have for multiple reasons. But one being, again, if Bitcoin is this thing that we would like people using to varying degrees, whether that's in totality, meaning Bitcoin is the only thing, or if that's alongside or as savings or whatever, it needs to be viewed and operated legitimately in a liberal democracy or in the West, meaning that we cannot continue professing, well, good luck getting my private keys. Good luck, all of these things. It's okay to,
well, by the way,
people make jokes.
By the way, I want to say something. Like, I don't think we should have to ask the government's permission to use Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's a different conversation.
Any more than I think I should ask the government's permission to fall in love with somebody. Like, I don't recognize the government's justifiable authority, to tell me like what I can and cannot do with my money within the bounds of the law. But I do think when I break the law, these questions of like sovereignty, individual sovereignty, go out the window very fast. I think that I have an obligation to follow the law, and that may be a difficult, nuanced concept for some people. But I think that if you want to have a serious conversation with these people who are deeply skeptical of Bitcoin for all the aforementioned reasons, then I think you should. I think you need to engage with those conversations in a serious way, as I try to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the people that really say these things initially, right, about whether it's everything will be fine, the state shouldn't exist, or the state should have complete hands off, or whatever, we'll figure it out. People will organize, whatever the case may be. Like the government, I've even had people say, "Well, how are taxes going to work under Bitcoin?" I'm like, "You pay with Bitcoin. You pay your tax." Like, what are you talking about? They're like, "Well, they can't steal it." I'm like, they can, just like right now, like agents could show up, IRS, FBI, whatever, to come and seize assets from someone, just as they have. Due process, all of these things. It's not new, like you were saying.
This is a very weird notion. This is a very weird notion to me, that like the only reason I pay my taxes today is, I guess what they're saying
is because they have my direct deposit through whatever I used to file.
is because of like I pay it through the withholding tax of my employer. I don't know what it is. That there's like that it's like that if all things being equal, I would just like flip the bird to the law and say, screw you, I'm not paying, while I continue to drive on the public roads and take my kids to public parks, and like enjoy enjoy the protections of the U.S. military from our adversaries around the world. And I mean, look, and there might be some immature response to that. That's like, I didn't choose to be born here. I didn't choose to be born to this world. Like, I don't want to be a part of this. Like, I mean, like, I don't know what to tell people, but you know, you're bound to the social contract whether you like it or not. You can leave. We don't have laws against people leaving the country, but I would suggest that most countries have similar notions to some extent.
Yeah. And I think too, there's so many other things I could say on this point that I think I'm just tired of wasting breath on, because very few people actually agree with this. One of the things I did want to tie it back to, though, it's not just a Bitcoin thing, but some of the things we're talking about, I found myself, you probably feel similarly. I at least detect this, probably especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But beyond that, for me as well, I found myself getting much more patriotic in this past year. I think it's because I've continued to butt up against people that I'm not sure if I share the same values with. I'm not sure if I share the same worldview as, which is, for all its brokenness and imperfection, like the the United States, the Constitution, the First Amendment. Just like yourself, I've been to other parts of the world that talk favorably of the foundation of the United States, of the Constitution. Our Constitution and First Amendment was very inspirational um, to a place like South Africa, where apartheid was very deep and where Nelson Mandela had huge ties to the US that I had the privilege to spend a lot of time in, especially in undergrad, and study and
Yeah.
learn from as a sociology major. So I've found myself coming back to this point. Could be the rise of Trump and populism in that way since 2016. There's all these other things where I'm deeply, proudly American in that regard, because I think the values that this country has, like first and foremost, above
Yeah.
a
Okay.
Bitcoiner.
I have a flag right here. There we go.
Nice. There you go. There you go.
I keep that right in my room.
Yeah. There you go.
To remind.
I think too, and it's not patriotism, Bible beating, certain party affiliation type thing. It's more like the values of diversity, the values of freedom and free speech, the values of being whoever you want to be. Some of these, quite frankly, maybe libertarian notions that some people might believe in, but also
I don't consider those libertarian notions.
no. But my point being, yeah, no, I
As a
don't
scholar
either.
of liberalism, I think I would push back hard on that. Happy to get
Yeah,
into a
well,
conversation about Mill or, but yeah, sure.
I was going to say the the self-professed libertarians online, right, who talk about, like, I want to be free to do X, Y, and Z. I agree to a certain extent
Mhm.
with this American
Yeah.
experiment we have, with this democracy that we have to fight for every single day, with this liberal democracy, the things that
Yeah,
you beat a drum on a lot.
can we talk about like what the founders thought actually?
Yes.
As a scholar of the U.S. founding, like long before, by the way, like long before I was ever a technologist, long before I was ever an executive, like long before this, I was um, someone who is deeply enmeshed in political philosophy and the history of the American Revolution. I can't tell you how many times I read the Federalist Papers. I have admiration for James Madison and my one of my historical heroes, Thomas Jefferson. And I have a lot of kind things to say about a lot of the notions that they bestowed us on, building upon the amazing uh, philosophy of English liberty that sort of formed the intellectual basis for the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. Um, and I think these notions, such as the notion that's embodied in our First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, um, that that we have a right to freedom of speech, um, and a right to worship the way that we want to. It's obviously framed as a negative in the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law about these things. In order to, I guess, through through the negative frame, preclude the government from the power to abridge these things, is based fundamentally not on not on the notion that like we're entitled to our right to free speech from some like necessarily some on high cosmological importance. The reason why the grandfathers of modern what was sometimes is referred to in philosophy as English liberty, and I include sort of the names like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, maybe a little bit more later on down the line, like David Hume. Like these figures understood free speech as something important, not in service of individual self-actualization, not in a sense of I have a right to this because the universe gives me a right to this, that I was like born with this necessarily. The original idea of freedom of speech, and Mill gets into this in his famous essay on liberty, and he has this concept of higher justice and all these other things. But what he was ultimately getting at, and he talks about this in terms about the importance of these ideas being heard, not so much about the act of them being expressed, is because of the belief that no one individual has monopoly on truth, and that truth itself is an important transcendent ideal that we must all strive towards, and that in pursuit of that truth, we all also recognize, I guess, in this sort of Hobbesian frame, that cooperation is better than violence. As and to the extent that we can cooperate by having a shared project of the discovery of truth, and that our capacity to do that is predicated on our ability to have free speech, our ability to express these ideas in order to challenge each other, and to force ourselves to grapple with the realities that, like, we could always be wrong. Our knowledge is always provisional. It's subject to change. New findings in science and research can always upend our long-held notions of what is true. But that we understand that that the reason why free speech is important is to permit that progress in pursuit of truth. I don't recognize this conversation about free speech the way that a lot of these libertarians do, where it's just like, it's my fucking right to do it. It's like, okay, like I'm willing. I agree. Like at some level, like we have the First Amendment. It is your fucking right, to have freedom of speech. I'm not trying to take that away from you, but this notion that the reason why we have free speech is just some completely silly, like reductionist notion of like, because it's your right to. That's not why. The reason and the reason why I harp on this is because and I was talking about the founding of this country. These men, and they were men. We should acknowledge that we weren't at a place where women were sufficiently and culturally permitted into these conversations, and this is obviously something that we've grappled with over the last century and continue to grapple with. But like they didn't believe in libertarian notions. They had actually, believe it or not, vigorous arguments over whether or not they should try to install a new monarchy here in the United States. Some of the founders were open to the idea of George Washington being the first monarch of the country. Now, it didn't end up being a terribly popular idea, but like this notion that our founders were on this sort of like hyper individualist tear is a little bit indulgent. Mm-hmm. They all generally believed that organized society with a central government was necessary. Hence, they sought out to create a country that had a central government. They all agreed at some fundamental level that there was some notion of something called the common good or the general welfare, and we see this reflected in their words in the Federalist Papers. We see these terms show up in the Constitution itself. The notion that like we are all part of this together, we the people, not like the government because it's a necessary evil. That's not the way that they framed it. There was in fact quite a bit of approbation for the idea that the state was a good thing, that it could embody our collective will, that it could in fact be a legitimate thing through this experiment of what we call self-government, by which we, through our system of liberal laws and liberal constitutions and constitutional republic, seek out the legitimacy of that government and give legitimacy to those who would govern us through our relationship with collective universal suffrage. This was how they thought about it. They would not have recognized these modern libertarian notions as making much sense at all. They would be quite surprised if any of these men, Jefferson, Madison, any of the founding fathers, Washington, Samuel Adams, any of these guys, and they're like certainly not. Why is my brain suddenly like not working this morning? Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton certainly wouldn't have recognized these notions. I think they would look at them and they would see someone like, say, yes, like a Murray Rothbard or some of his contemporaries, like a Hans Hermann Hoppe or any of these other like hyper individualist, like hyper libertarian folks, and they would recognize these people as having very degenerate views, I think, relative to how they conceived of what human civilization was and could be. And they chose very deliberately to set up a government with, it turns out, 3 branches, co-equal branches of government, that like we were to have through various mechanisms of achieving democratic legitimacy, the ability to choose representatives that represent us, but are existing in places of public trust to discharge that trust on our collective behalves, but not out of some sort of reductionist notion of like, we're all just atomized individuals who have the right to do whatever the fuck we want to do. That is not how these people saw it. And I do think there's a lot sometimes of modern libertarian and arch conservative thought that I think goes very much against the realities of what the founding fathers of this country thought. Now, these guys were very skeptical of authority, it turns out, given the fact that they chose insurrection against the British Crown, and ultimately, ultimately culminating in the Continental Congress of the original 13 colonies declaring their independence, and the famous declaration that was in fact authored by the representative of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. So I don't recognize like libertarianism as like having a proper home in that discussion, and I don't think if those people were brought in a time machine forward to today would recognize these concepts. I think they might actually look quite unfavorably on them, because these were men that believed in things like civic virtue, about putting the needs of the many above yourself, above the idea that the nation is more important than you. I would suggest that people read George Washington's goodbye speech. At the first beginning of the first peaceful transition of power. These notions of hyper individualism, of the atomized individualism that have become really cool in our hyper online world were certainly not present at the time of the founding of this country. And so I really feel like that needs to be said, because I feel like it's poorly understood.
As silly as it sounds sometimes, I do think there almost exists two types of people. The person that is online and that same person that is not online, that it is in a room with maybe you and myself and a few other people having a conversation. Will it sound as wild and bizarre as some of the posts that people put online espousing some of these views? No, some of it is a bit of an audience and amplification. I think there's something deeper going on. I think, you alluded a lot to the common good, right? And I think that's one reason I find myself becoming and trying to become more patriotic again, is just thinking of how do we coexist? How do we believe in the common good? Like in college, I was taught the concept of Ubuntu, and what Desmond Tutu talked about a lot about this, and Nelson Mandela saying, I am because we are. Like literally, this only works. You talked about species at the beginning of this conversation. All of this, whatever this is, only works so long as we're willing to care for one another. And we can talk about what are the best ways to do that. But
Yeah,
fundamentally, coming out of the gate and
yeah.
saying, it is me, like you were saying, there is a sickness and a fracture in the universe and the human psyche that for me is a little scary right now
And
with the
by the
mix of
way,
technology.
the politics of me is not a feature just of the right. It is also a feature of the politics of the left.
100%. Yes.
And uh, I want to be very clear about this, because I think people might be surprised to learn that at one of his rallies, Martin Luther King Jr. Recited the Pledge of Allegiance. This was he in fact, and obviously, uh, you know,
Is
he's
that not well
obviously.
known? I feel like that one's
Yeah,
pretty public. There are a few
he
times.
was
Yeah, yeah.
he was a deeply patriotic man for this
Yeah.
country
Mhm.
and its constitution.
He
Even
had
as
hope in the
he,
fabric of our country. That was the whole point.
yeah,
He could have
yeah,
said,
yeah.
we need to overthrow the country. He specifically did not.
No, he wanted the country to live up to its ideals that were so stated in the Constitution. And I think Barack Obama was I think another great, I think, orator of these ideas, as somebody who deeply believes in this country in a patriotic way. Like nobody can doubt how patriotic, say, that man is. And people and someone coming from his upbringing and the way that he has himself had been treated, had every reason in the world to not be patriotic.
Mhm.
And I and I talk to people all the time, people that, and I think this is a very, unfortunately, I think I'm going to just come out and say it. I think it's a very set of very online, very privileged people who look like you and me, quite frankly,
Yep.
who are projecting their own, like, more like moral crises onto other people. And I think they mean well. I think they deeply care about the injustices that they see being meted out upon those who, let's be honest, our society is continuing to fail in many ways. I don't think it's realistic to say that we live in a society that is post racial, or that it is post sexist, or like, we know this isn't true. But I also would suggest to anyone else who would insist that that's true, and I would agree with them, to suggest that we have not made significant moral progress and that we shouldn't be proud of that, I think is a deeply disturbing notion. One that's, by the way, I mentioned Barack Obama. He himself has made this point that we can't, that we have to have a capacity to recognize how far we've come, because the distance between where we were, I mentioned 1981, the year I was born, the idea that anyone would think that two gay men or two a same sex or two lesbian women could get married. Like, could you imagine? Like, I'd be surprised if you could have gotten more than 7% of the population in 1981 to sign up for that notion. But that capacity for change, that capacity to recognize that we're not living up to our ideals and that we keep trying to get better, that we keep trying to reform things, we've I mean I think we learned once again in over the last 10 years that we have a problem with policing in this country, that we have that I think anyways is symptomatic of the fact that that police are not held to the same standards that anyone else should be held to when it comes to respecting the law. That because nobody is above the law. Not somebody who has a badge and a gun, certainly not a president of the United States or a member of Congress or a member of the Supreme Court. That is a foundational principle. And to the extent that we are failing people because there are individuals in our society, be they police officers, be they members of the halls of power in offices of public trust, who are acting outside the boundaries of the law, then those are obviously things that need to be attended to seriously. But I would suggest that we have made progress in all of these things. And to your point about wanting to feel patriotic, I think you have a lot to feel patriotic for, because we have made progress on all of these issues. And we have challenges today. And there's certainly a lot to be cynical about. But you shouldn't feel guilty about being patriotic, because all of these things are just signposts along I guess what Martin Luther King so famously said, right? The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. If there wasn't such a more beautiful notion.
I do believe deep down, because I mentioned, I feel like there are people that are very different than me value-wise, on should the United States exist or not, a government because I still, sure, sometimes on this podcast, I'll specifically focus on who the guest is, on a certain thing happening in Bitcoin and whatever. But my underpinning and beliefs, I still, a bit of a romantic in me, is that the government is for the people, by the people. I'd still like to achieve that rather than achieve the overthrow of the government. I am not an anarchist. I'm not in that camp. I have friends that are in that camp, and I can understand and talk to people in that camp. So I am a romantic in that I do believe in that notion that we can continue to go on that path. I do believe in the notion of the common good. I talk all the time about my general sense. You could put it much more eloquently than me, but my general sense that not enough people are trying to focus on, and I try to. It's really hard to try to focus on being kind and decent throughout the day, whether I'm passing someone, walking my dog, whether I'm thinking about the common good. I'm not thinking about, am I allowed to do this or not? I'm not thinking just about, well, this isn't illegal or this is my right. I'm thinking about what is the common good, or what is the decency of what I'm about to say or what I'm about to do. Or if I'm going to be angry or passionate, do I feel valid in it enough to upset whatever I am fighting against? I just trying to think outside of yourself, outside of your privileged position, our privileged position.
To quote maybe one of the most famous presidential quotes in American history, John F. Kennedy's inauguration speech. Most famously, he asked the question to not ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. The idea of civic virtue, that this isn't a question of what can I get out of this life. It's a question of the construction of shared meaning, of shared purpose, that we are in this together, that we built this together, that we defended this together. Like, I think that, and this gets back to like what I said about like taking history really seriously. I think, look, I came from a military family. Both of my grandparents uh, fought in the Second World War. Both of them. Actually, my grandparents. One of my grandparents was from Poland, and my other grandfather is from Canada, where I was born. Um, and both of them were there on D-Day, alongside the Allied forces of the United States, Great Britain, Australia, um, members of the French resistance, including forces that were operating in British units, including my grandfather, who had escaped Poland after the Germans had rolled into Warsaw. These men were asked by us, by our countries, um, to storm the beaches of Normandy one uh, fateful midsummer or early summer day. These men, wearing the flag of our country, uh, stormed those beaches. 10,000 of them died that very first day, fighting their way um, into the beaches of France to establish a beachhead that would then become the basis for the liberation of Europe. That was a profound sacrifice that I happen to know that luckily I'm alive, so both of my grandparents returned from that war. But I grew up in a family where they were deeply proud of that. They were deeply proud of their sacrifice. And if there was something that I saw bring a tear to their eye, and I was lucky enough to know my grandfather, who was there on Juno Beach, in that sector. The sense that he instilled in me when he would talk to me about, and he didn't scare me with like the gory details, but he would tell me when I was a young child that the thing that he wanted me, and I'm getting a bit teary eyed here, like remembering this, is that he wanted me to always remember, was that like he didn't want me to forget what those people who didn't come home uh, did, and he wanted me to. Sorry, I mean, this is like, I mean, they, they, like you talk to these veterans, and they're not angry. My grandfather was not angry about being asked to go to war. In fact, he was a volunteer. He signed up. He wasn't drafted. Uh, when uh, when he realized that this was before the United States had actually entered the war, he realized that the United Kingdom was imperiled, and Hitler was marshaling his forces, and this all led to the abortive invasion at Dunkirk. My grandfather signed up, and volunteered to be sent into battle to defend to defend the civilization that he believed in, that he wanted his children to survive in. And I can tell you that the times that I my my family was very close to the Legion. Every November 11th, when I was a young child, uh, I, I stood there for the moment of silence. Um, a very solemn occasion, and I remember my grandfather and his veteran friends, and which, by the way, one of them was, and I got a chance to meet him, believe it or not, was James Doohan, who some people might know as Scotty from Star Trek. He was in my father's unit. He was his Batman, and I got a chance to meet me. I got a chance to meet him. One of the values that was deeply instilled in me was to never forget that, never forget the sacrifice of these things. Please make sure that your grandchildren know about like my friends and my family that didn't make it home. I want them to know that they did that for you. And like that to me is like to the extent that like people are like, well, like I don't give a shit about that. Those were just like stupid wars. Like it's like, no, I mean, like I take deep meaning from the fact that there were people like my grandfather. He volunteered. He wasn't forced to. Maybe he would have been. Like people might have said it didn't matter. Maybe he would have been drafted anyways. But he volunteered because he believed in something. And I think like we owe it to people. We owe it to our posterity, I think, to remind people of that and to not take that for granted. So yeah, like I think there's nothing wrong with patriotism. I mean, we can have discussions around nationalism and dangerous notions like that. But like being proud of your country and being proud of the sacrifices of those who laid down their life so that you can sit here and have a conversation with me about Bitcoin. I mean, like, I can't think of something that's more deeply meaningful.
Yeah, and I think too the patriotism comes from the values positions, right? Like just thinking about what are the values of the things you just mentioned. Like what were they fighting against? And I mean, it breaks my heart to think of the nuance of German soldiers that didn't want to be there, right? Of different people that were used as pawns for one of the many instances throughout history, but a huge instance of evil incarnate in Hitler and the regime. Those are things that if that happened in another way, I do think life and humanity would look quite different. And we do
The
have to
banal
battle.
the banality of evil.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I do think we have to, in micro and macro ways, daily fight for those values. And it sounds silly pulling it back to we're having a conversation, intertwining Bitcoin in this, right? But my point being, talking about values in ways of what are we doing with our daily life, our professional life, our me doing a podcast about Bitcoin or someone working and advocating in Bitcoin. What are the values? And sometimes I feel that the values I'm operating on are very different than the values of other people professing those certain things, whether it's ego, whether it's mental illness, for whatever political side here, whatever we're talking about, for the notion of I, for the notion of me, for the notion of, well, everything's a conspiracy. So fuck everything. We are in a post conspiracy. Nothing is real. The government is utterly and completely and totally co opted. So every man and family for
Post
themselves.
truth.
Yeah,
Post
post
truth
truth.
is how I would describe it.
Yeah, and that is my bigger fear today, because a lot of people in the Bitcoin space and obviously a lot of folks listening to this show are very fond of liberal democracy, probably more progressive and left would probably vote for the Democratic Party and yada yada. But just the values we're expressing, I think a lot of people would agree with. But just thinking about like what we're fighting for, thinking about being in the Bitcoin space, yeah, there's just a lot where I continuously say, like, what are we doing here? But my fear isn't that the government is going to take over and take my Bitcoin. My fear is that my fellow humans, that are we on the same page? Are we collectively in this together? Are some so far gone? Are we broken? Are we where are we going from here? How are we progressing and evolving as a people together? I'm not worried about my Bitcoin or a Bitcoin ban. I'm worried about what is the state of democracy, not just because of an individual like Donald Trump. And people will say, you have Trump derangement syndrome. And I'm like, a lot of folks online have liberal derangement syndrome. They obsess over what I or a liberal will think. And I'm like, it's not just a Donald Trump. Donald Trump came from somewhere. Other people besides Donald Trump, like people have come from somewhere. Where are we going? I'm very fearful of social media, as silly as that sounds. A little personal anecdote. I found myself getting more traction again through my personal X account. And I decided to um, deactivate my personal X account. We still have the pod accounts everywhere so people can find our content and learn, and people are where they are on social media. But I realized it was a bit of an addiction. It was a
I
bit
know.
of a
I realize like I've like failed to completely take my own advice when it comes to social media, and I'm such a huge hypocrite on this. But
well,
like,
it's so tough. Well, it's so tough because it is the life we find ourselves in, whatever industry, whatever thought, whatever it is uniquely tied now to that digital identity. And I'm
yeah,
a huge proponent of, there's a whole another conversation of Noster and the thoughts of what that is and could be. I'm a very big advocate of that, even though that community is very insular and very Bitcoin and right and things like that. It is, for me, less toxic, less addictive. I think it's smaller. It's not algorithm driven. It's not corporation driven. There's a lot of just differences inherent. But one thing with X is um, mental health wise, it was a time suck of hours and hours. There'd be times where I would just break down with my wife, feeling a certain way about the world, and my wife being like,
yeah.
"This isn't worth it." Like, what? I wasn't feeling
It
okay being so tapped in. I felt not human. Like I was like, I need to get my humanity back. And it sounds very dramatic, but that's truly where I was at
no,
with it.
I've thought about this like a lot. And honestly, and I know that he's a very polarizing figure, but I will invoke, Sam Harris and his some of his thoughts on this.
Sure. And I like some of his thoughts and I vehemently
Yeah,
disagree with others. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I have my own issues with Sam. Some of them are actually deeply philosophical, but like,
Mm.
but I think when his sort of observation about um, how you tend to view humanity and like how you tend to view other people um, when you're sort of like spending a lot of time on social media, like on like Twitter, on these things, and then when you kind of take yourself away from it for like a few weeks, and there's just sort of this like kind of psychic shift that kind of happens in you, and like you don't like, because I don't know if this happens to you, but I'm admitting that it happens to me, and I think it's a really bad thing. Is like on the 4th of July, we went to I took the family and us. We went down to Long Beach here in Los Angeles for the 4th of July festivities, and I kind of noticed myself doing something that I felt very unproud of. I felt like I didn't want to keep doing it. I kept looking at people and trying to look for cues on whether or not what I thought their politics were.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say that. That's a weird sixth sense I just had. I'm like, I've done
And
that too.
yeah, and I really hate. I actually think I brought this up with my wife when I was there, and I told her that I was doing this, and I said that like I hate that I'm doing this right
Do
now.
you think it was the fourth
Um,
too? Do you think it was the fact that it was an
uh,
event that some different groups have co-opted? Like I was saying, like patriotism, right? That bothers me.
yeah,
That it feels a bit
yeah,
co-opted by a political party right now.
yeah. I have thoughts about that, but
Yeah, it's a separate
no, no,
conversation. Sure.
yeah, but no. I mean, I think that I do it more when I'm like kind of my view of the world is sort of shaped by that 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 viewport, that sort of that scroll of information represents. And I think it because I think one of the things that happens, and I haven't thought about this deeply until now, so I'm kind of sorry if I'm speaking extemporaneously about these thoughts as they come. But like I kind of feel like what happens is there's something about these conversations that feel very existential, like very sort of like if my side of the fence, my side of the argument doesn't win, then we're fucked. Like,
Hmm.
and the other side feels like the same thing.
Hmm.
And you have this sort of, there's this sort of like set of social incentive structures towards becoming increasingly existential, because I think existential conversations tend to garner more attention. the more something seems like an emergency and needs to command immediate attention, the more likely it is to get attention. And so you get this sort of like emergent phenomenon where everyone's kind of like trying to like make their view of the world seem like an emergency. And maybe even I have been guilty of that. Um, Although I do think there are certain things that I would suggest are moral emergencies, and I'll defend them.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that like leads to this weird psychology where, because you start to like think about everything in existential frames, it suddenly starts to feel like it does matter a lot more whether that guy's a Kamala voter or a Trump voter or an RFK Jr. voter. And because you show up to the conversation in this very existential frame, it makes a lot of sense that you're worried about this, in this very, and I find that like when you separate yourself from it it does become a lot easier to see the humanity in people. And that worries me. It worries me like, because I don't think that the scroll is going to go away. I don't think I hope that that as Nostr grows and I'm very hopeful at working on decentralized technologies. I hope that we get towards a more decentralized future where we don't have potentially bad gatekeepers of our information that may have malign interests that may in fact be disaligned with our interests. I very much am on the same page with Jack that like human free will and agency are like the two most important things that we need to be thinking about. I'm very much aligned with that. But I do hope though that I get worried sometimes, not to sound cynical, that we haven't quite learned how to navigate the psychological challenges that this deluge of information and this deluge of existential conversation is like putting on our human brains, that like our brains were clearly not designed for this. Like there's this I actually think that if the one thing that should scare people, I think, is the sense of the passage of time, right? And there are some researchers who've spoken about this, and I don't think it gets enough thought, which is, and we kind of joked about how the last month felt like a year. And the fact that it seems like history now is becoming this like grueling daily catastrophe after daily catastrophe after daily catastrophe. And our sense of like time and proportionality of like time and the salience of these events has sort of like led us into this world where we all have these insanely short-term memories. Like I don't like, I mean, like we had an assassination attempt against one of the
I was thinking about
presidential
this
candidates.
yesterday.
And like I talk I mean, it wasn't me. I was someone else was talking to me recently about this, and they were saying like, I feel like I'd completely forgotten about that. And when I thought about it, I'm like, come to mention it now, like I kind of agree. It's weird. It's weird because I mean, like when I grew up, and we had things like this happen. 9/11 was obviously an example of something that like I feel like we didn't move past that for like years, like let alone like or
dude, I still think about I was in fourth grade. I still think about that day a lot. Like however many years
yeah.
later now, like 23 years.
Yeah, and there's like part of me that thinks if 9/11 happened today, and maybe I'm wrong about this, and I hope I am, that like we would have forgotten about it in our collective memory within 2 or 3 months at the way in which like
I'm not trying to be not sensitive to it or shrugging it off, but I suspect you're right. I really do.
And I think that that's a consequence of our information overload, our very online lives, And something about that, I think, has to be acknowledged, that like we're running up against the limits of our own psychology. We're running up against the limits of our collective capacity to negotiate an ever increasingly complex world. And I think that that is a disturbing notion. If there's one that I think that should really worry people, it's that it's the sense that we've developed this advanced technological and scientific civilization. The stakes are getting higher; they're not getting lower. We already had nuclear weapons, but now we're on the verge of having autonomous drones that could potentially be mass produced by the millions. And I don't even want to think about like what warfare could look like in 10 years when you combine drone technology with artificial intelligence, and you start getting into some like pretty dark thoughts about how some of these things could get away from us if we're not very careful. Um, I certainly don't think that the answer is to destroy the government and to bring the government down. It seems to me that if anything is going to save us, it's going to be some collective capacity to contain these threats within some concept of a common good, to regulate these things. I mean, I don't like. Are we going to let like people just like program autonomous drones to go and like kill somebody and then take it into their backyard and be like, fly away, birdie, go find your target? Like, I mean, at some point, like, that's going to be possible with off the shelf consumer equipment and off the shelf open source AI models. That might already be possible. I mean, for
Mm-hmm.
someone who's enterprising enough, as somebody who has the technical skills of, quite frankly, someone like me, even could, and that's pretty terrifying. We're going to have answers for those kinds of questions, and we're going to have answers pretty quickly. And I think our incapacity to deal with all this complexity, like that is just one among many serious concerns that are adding up as the stakes get higher and higher and higher. I would suggest to people that things are likely not going to calm down. They're going to become somewhat more concerning as time goes on. And I don't think that the outcome of this election is going to be dispositive, quite frankly, to whether or not our liberal democracy survives. I've said my views in other forums, and people can go seek that out. I don't want to get into partisan politics here. What I think should happen, but like I would suggest that these problems are not going away. And yeah, like I'll I'll proudly say I think government is going to have to be part of the solution to address some of these challenges. Because we have to recognize that we do seem to be coming up against some serious limitation of our own brains, our own psychology, our own human nature, and we seem to have some incapacity to grapple with the complexity that's being foisted upon us by our technological and scientific society that we've created for ourselves. And we have a capacity to destroy ourselves. Like that's beyond question.
Yeah, while you were talking, it made me think. For a while, we felt and decided, especially kind of in these online communities, which quite frankly, everyone's just a part is online at some extent, right? Whether it's someone addicted to scrolling on Instagram or finding community on X or on Reddit or whatever the case may be, like infused into the digital. I think for a while, humanity in our country, whatever, was like we were fighting against each other, our tribes, our whatever, like say in the US context. And then it's to the point where you have some, again, the online right libertarians, whatever, saying it's the deep state, it's the government, it's this and that. I think you're getting to the point that I'm feeling a bit more and helping me articulate and think about more, which I'll do a lot more after this conversation, is that enemy is still out there floating around. It's this ghost of we're running into the limitations of our monkey brains, hitting
Yep.
technology and interacting with each other and doing what people did hundreds of years ago, which the weather changed. There was a thunderstorm, then they sacrificed someone
Yeah.
to
And
change
by the
that.
way,
We're
and
not
by the way,
too
there's a paradox. There's a paradox here, right? There's a paradox that has to be acknowledged, by the way, which is that
mhm,
like, I grapple with this all the time because I recognize that it would be much better for my mental health to unplug from a lot of this. And I have a lot of reasons to unplug. I've been through some terrible tragedies in recent years in my personal life. There's a moral question that I have, which is around sort of like what are my obligations as a concerned and responsible citizen to engage in these conversations and to engage in these conversations where they're happening. And I think it's a difficult proposition. I think that that's like why people like myself and maybe you, maybe at some point will get like drawn back towards, like posting again, um, is because these conversations are happening.
Hmm.
There is something about them that seems to be influential. It does seem these conversations where they're happening do seem to shape the perspectives of those people who are in the halls of power in private and public institutions. And there's something to, and there is some unsettling notion that one has to hold there of saying, well, I'm just not going to participate in this conversation. Well, it's then like, well, like, what happens if like enough people who are like me decide the same, and we simply surrender ourselves to this post-truth, like populist uh, uh, maelstrom that uh, I think speaks to all these sort of degenerate notions that I've been like trying really, really hard to resist and argue against. And I'm not sure how to resolve that paradox, because it does seem to me that to the extent that like there is a there is democratic deliberation happening in the private sphere and civil society, it's happening online. It's very much happening online. um, I like the fact that we have long form podcasts like this to try and have some more considered discussion rather than fitting it into 255 characters or whatever the limit is on these on these
Hmm.
things. But like, um, I think I don't know how to, I don't know what to make. I don't know what to make of the paradox that it seems bad for my mental health and everyone else's mental health to be engaged, and then have to sort of be faced with the notion of, well, okay, well, these conversations seem to matter. They seem to affect how politicians think about things. They seem to it seems to matter about how elite individuals in our society think about these things. And so it's like, am I like is it responsible to abandon the playing field for my own mental health? I mean, I don't know. I think that's like part of the problem is that like there's two truths here. It seems bad for us, but it also seems to be like pretty important to where uh, uh, idea formation is happening in the
Hmm.
political sphere. So I don't know what to make of that, and I don't know what the solution is. I'm hopeful that things like Noster and other technologies like it could lead to a more healthy balance. I'm also hopeful that things like podcasts like this, long form podcasts, continue to become more popular over time and people start to slow down and try to like go in deeply into ideas rather than just reacting to everything. Based on what their gut tells them, but maybe like question their gut a little bit and ask themselves, why is it that I think this way? Why am I so sure that this policy would be bad for me? Why do I believe what that person says about this? Do I really have reason to believe that they're credible on this topic? I think that yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer is there. I don't think that the answer is that we can just all unplug, unfortunately. And while I also acknowledge that us all being plugged in seems to be driving us all slowly insane, I'm not sure what the answer is going to be there. I think it's going to hope. I mean, one hope I have, my positive. I'll leave this. I'll try to cap end this thought with a positive thought, is I hope that, like has happened in previous generations, that younger people who've grown up in this environment, with their younger, more sort of fresh eyes on these problems, unlike old farts like myself. I'm only in my 40s, but I'm like but I am middle aged, and I have to admit that
Well, even me, I'm very steeped in millennial and Gen Z.
yeah,
It
yeah,
feels like
yeah,
a
yeah.
different world at some point.
I'm hoping that like young, youthful ideas can learn to grapple with these things in a culturally healthier way. And I think there's been some things I've read from certain researchers who suggest that some of that's starting to happen, that you're starting to see some self-limiting behavior on things like Instagram and TikTok and among young people that seems to be ameliorating some of the concerns that like the youth were in a sort of uncontrolled spiral. And you're seeing like a resurgence. Like one thing I've noticed that's given me a lot of hope, that I just mentioned, is I feel like there's a lot more debate happening now. There's a lot you see, in sort of YouTube. There's a lot more conservatives and liberals and honestly even Trump folks and Kamala folks that are
Mhm.
coming on the same podcasts, and they're arguing with each other, and
We've
something
done it on this
resemble
show a few
yeah,
times
and
now. We're
something
starting to.
resembling good and something resembling good faith.
Mhm.
And I see a lot more of that happening. I see these sort of figures that are sort of going out into the battlefield, and they're just saying, you know, people will like mileage will vary on some of these people, but you see guys who've come up from these like online gaming communities like Destiny, and he's sort of like making it a point to sort of like be willing to argue with anyone about anything. And I think that's really healthy. It kind of reminds me about like the sort of the early internet, like the 2000s. I feel like there was this time online where it was like the time of like the new atheists, and you had like Christopher Hitchens and all these like
I mean,
guys,
I
and there
went
was like
deep in that phase when I
yeah, yeah,
left my conservative
yeah.
religion bubble, and then I went deep in that
Yeah.
phase, and I'm glad I did. I came out on the other side a little different, but
But I feel like we're seeing the beginnings of something like that kind of more open intellectual culture returning. And I'm
mhm.
not saying look, I want
You got
to
to question whether it's genuine or not too, with the
yeah,
incentives and the YouTube algorithm. Yeah, all of that. But I
yeah,
do understand what you're saying.
but it feels like something's happening there,
Mhm.
that something generationally has shifted, and I think that people have recognized that there is an appetite now for people to sort of like maybe get to the bottom of these disagreements a little bit more deeply. And I think people are feeling exhausted. I think physically exhausted from the daily struggle. And I think a struggle of our politics and what seems like catastrophe after catastrophe. And I think people are now starting to get a little bit more interested in whether or not like the things that they're hearing from politicians are true or not, and like why is it that like we believe this or that or whatever. And we're starting to see that there's a lot of folks, and you see this too. Like I think Substack is like another example of this. I think I would argue that a lot of healthy, independent sort of intellectual thought is now happening there. I would say that. Um, I mean, we can debate whether or not the, like you said, the YouTube algorithm is like is on our side here or not. But like, yeah, the rise of a lot of these like YouTubers who seem to genuinely, I think, like are having what I would characterize as good faith debates
Mhm.
about a lot of these things. And honestly, it felt I don't think we got away from that, especially during the years of the Trump administration. It really felt like there was no space, especially for liberals and conservatives or libertarians and leftists to debate. It seemed like everyone thought that the arguments were all over and we were just going to fight it out in the streets if necessary. And it seems like there's been at least some retrenchment, some willingness, and honestly, like it's encouraging that we're now seeing a lot of people on the left, uh, broadly categorized, deciding that they're willing to be like that they're willing to fly the flag again. You're seeing this rise of liberal patriotism. Maybe your recent thoughts might embody that. I don't want to speak for you,
Mhm.
but I think it's endemic of the fact that there's this very degenerate polarity that we found ourselves in a few years ago, not too distant past, um, I think basically reached a point of exhaustion for everyone. And now there is a space to really talk about these ideas in a really open, honest, and exploratory way. And and that seeing that start to happen is giving me hope. Like maybe something happens in November and this election goes a certain way, then it all goes away and we're all back to square one and we're all just back to like maximum polarity again.
Mm-hmm.
But I hope not. I hope that this trend that I'm starting to see continues, because if we are to solve these problems as a society, if we are to solve these challenges around, like, having good laws and good policies for Bitcoin and all these things and all these existential problems, it's going to come through that. It's going to come through that sort of open, honest dialogue of like figuring out these big ideas and these big problems in a constructive way, that ultimately seeks compromise, because we all must remind ourselves that we share this country together, and whatever you and I might disagree upon, we must have a capacity to agree to disagree, because if we do not, then we are only left with like bullets, essentially. And I think none of us wants to be there. I think we all want to live in a country where we're all capable of compromise. So I think these sorts of vigorous conversations, these intellectually honest debates, are deeply needed, and I'm glad to see that some of them are happening.
Yeah, I feel that too. And I wanted to pull on something you said just a minute ago about like even my own personal use on X and something like that. I think to use a word that a lot of our libertarian right friends online use is personal responsibility. And they like to say that the left and progressives don't have any personal responsibility, don't believe in that, just want the government to do everything, yada, yada. Again, just throwing out extreme whatever. Well, the one thing I do believe is that the coming to a space like a digital forum or something that we know is kind of unhealthy for us, or kind of that humans that sped up faster than we did in this evolutionary process.
Yeah.
We have to come, I have to come to become a little more disciplined, to have some personal responsibility to say, we're still active through, I'm still getting out the message that I want in my platform. And I feel like my role in whatever all of this is, and my role in Bitcoin through this podcast, which we are still posting on X, through the podcast handle, through all others, still writing on Substack. We've been trying to do more spaces recently to have more open conversation with folks, especially as the election gets closer. I've been going on other podcasts and spaces more. So I am still involved. But the one thing I had to do was say, I'm not going to echo that from my personal account, because there was something about my name and my face, and then me being a progressive in this space,
Mm.
getting more attacks, getting more, and then I would argue with people. And then I would take personal offense when it's someone that I knew was a big figure in the space saying what I believed are crazy things, and it would affect me. And I'm like, I need to remove that from the equation. So it's not necessarily being done with everything. It's the discipline to say that part, the bad outweighs the good for me, and I think for others. And then also the discipline to say, after a certain point at night, my phone is now in another room. I've been doing that. I didn't used to do that as much.
Yeah, I
So there's
think.
some like
By the way,
discipline things.
yeah, and by the way, I have like I guess a considered a nuanced view on a lot of these figures. We don't have to name them,
Mm,
but I think that I think that a lot of it is endemic of what some people might call influencer culture.
yes.
And I
Mm,
think I
not
think
just the Bitcoin thing for sure.
yeah, it's not just a Bitcoin thing. We see this, and I think and I think a lot of people are just clout chasers,
Yeah.
and they ultimately, because they're clout chasers, they have a tendency to get captured by their audiences, and they want to give their audiences specific the audiences like what more of what they want, because it brings in more advertising dollars or more engagement. And I mean, obviously the concept of audience capture is like well known by economists and sociologists. But I think a lot of this is going on. The sense that like this fear that if they take a position that they understand to be potentially deeply unpopular with a large segment of their audience, that they will avoid doing so because their livelihood is ultimately at stake. And I think this has the tendency, unfortunately, to incentivize people towards becoming more and more unconsidered, and more driven towards just like feeding their audience, you know, morsels of what they want to hear, slogans and poorly considered thoughts that give people dopamine hits and make them feel like they're going to get rich, and they're going to uh, be the pioneers of the new world while the old one comes burning to the ground and crashes around them. And this is obviously like very exciting, and apparently there's quite a bit of money to be made by like feeding those notions. But I think in some ways a lot of these people are captured, and I actually think that, in some cases, I feel like having talked to some of these people like face to face, and sometimes recognizing that there are times where I think they might be closer to agreeing with me on certain things and they might want to let on, but are also just afraid to agree because they find they see the logic in what I'm saying, and they can't necessarily escape the fact that it has some factual basis.
Mm-hmm.
But they also recognize that if they were to agree with me, that half of their audience would revolt and go listen to the other podcaster.
Yeah.
And I think, and so I think that it's very clear that that's this influencer culture that we have, that clout chasing has led to, I think, this sort of uh, degenerate mode where people are being rewarded for telling people what they want to hear, but not necessarily what they themselves believe to be true. And I think that's part of the problem that we see, not just in Bitcoin. I think this has actually kind of become a pervasive part of internet culture more generally. I think in terms of like politics, and everything is a cult now, right? Like
Yeah.
you whatever brand you buy, you're part of a cult now. You know, I mean, I think Apple was maybe like kind of like the first sort of like major uh, uh, kind of technological cult, if you will. I think
Like a
it's much less so.
mainstream. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, where like kind of, well, no, I don't know if you remember like a time like 15 years ago, right? Like, there were a lot of people that viewed Apple users as sort of these cultish figures
Yeah.
that
When I
were
was a
just
kid,
like
it was a weird thing. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
yeah, yeah, and I kind of feel like Apple, in some ways, was sort of the first cult, that
Mm.
is sort of like cult of this sort of like technological era. And I feel like there's been so much attempts by other brands, and then ultimately the influencer culture, to try and literally turn every idea and every cause into a cult. And the way you kind of go about that is through this clout chasing, and which you fall victim to audience capture, and it becomes a self-reinforcing thing, and before you know it, you yourself have become a cult of personality attached to ideas that don't resemble anything that appears to be reasonable from,
Mm-hmm.
like, as the philosophers might say, the view from nowhere. And I think that's like a big part of the description of like what's going on.
Well, Mike, I knew this would be a long one and a good one. And I want to say too, so I'm gonna keep the title for this episode that I already have in my mind about a crypto reset and the Democrats. It's a bit of a surprise to people. They'll come into this episode and be like, "You talked about philosophy and the common good and just like humanity," but I think too the last kind of closing
You
thing,
have to
and then
start. I think you have to start there if you're going to have a
that
conversation about how Bitcoin can help the world. That's where you have to
yeah, well
start.
that's my point is because even the arguments, and I'll leave with this and get your kind of final thoughts and plug here. My thoughts being, even with this conversation around will Democrats do a reset around crypto? What will Kamala do? What will Trump do? All of these conversations have lived in this echo chamber of online versus the reality of what Bitcoin is, what will actually happen with Bitcoin. Like you and I are kind of in the agreements of I'm not worried about a Bitcoin ban. It's become this cult of personality, this why would you have this conversation? Like, yes, Democrats definitely are. No, they're not. It's just this whole online unhealthy obsession recently with trying to figure out. what is XYZ going to do about Bitcoin or against Bitcoin or all of these things. And Bitcoin is one thing. Enter in whatever political thing or whatever thing you care about into that equation, right? So even the title and and obviously we touched on it a little bit with kind of and I think I got your answer a little bit, which is like these are nuanced conversations. These are people in Congress with their own views and their own very good questions to ask about Bitcoin. It's such this online unhealthy obsession with what is this politician going to do regarding Bitcoin? What is this industry? And I'm getting it all the time, right? In terms of like my view, even like I am not a single issue voter. Like, well, you should be. If you care about people, why would you not vote for the pro Bitcoin president, right? Like this is a whole nother conversation.
If we had infinite time, I have a lot of thoughts on the whole idea.
But
of
my
being
point being, I'm really glad the conversation went where it went. I wanted it to go where I thought it would go, into these deeper conversations, for hopefully people to take a step back that are listening to Bitcoin podcasts, that are listening to our show, which I'm very grateful for, which are involved in online communities, which are maybe obsessing and staying up at night thinking about, okay, the government's going to ban Bitcoin. We have to fight. What are we going to do? And just take a step back, see that humanity is just dealing with a lot all the time, and give grace and like you said, slow down and have deep, thoughtful conversations. And I'm glad we were able to do that today, which ideally we'd be in a room together doing this, but that's one of the things of technology is we're able to do this, right? And so
maybe we'll do it together in one place. That'd be great.
Yeah, I would love that. But anyway, Mike, thank you so much for doing this marathon conversation with me and being open to it. Is there anything that you wanted to mention? Obviously, we'll put in the show notes, like you guys are doing awesome work at TBD. You talk a lot and have other writings about decentralized technologies, which that's another thing we kind of talked about the entire time, right? The fact that Nostr is springing up and Blue Sky and others is because people hate the centralized notion of other social media. The fact that Bitcoin popped up, a similar type thing in the human brain. We constantly are searching for new and better ways to do things. So anything on your side that you want to mention to people, whether it's like articles or thought you've been doing to check out, whether it's anything going on at TBD with Underblock, anything like that?
Yeah. We're continuing to develop these technologies like alongside a broader ecosystem. I continue to be a big believer in the importance of technologies like decentralized identity and verifiable credentials, because I believe for various reasons that that having a native identity layer for the internet that allows people to own and control their own identity leads to a very important incentive structure that I think needs to exist, not for many reasons. Even if you're disconcerted about the civil rights implications, I might suggest if you're concerned about having fair competition and there not to be monopoly players that own our identity online, or you want to ensure that there's an ecosystem for innovation because you want there to be consumer choice and a wide landscape of options and opportunities for all of us, then I think that these kinds of technologies are really important for changing those incentives. They're also very important, I think, in the civil rights frame as well. And I think our goal is to build these technologies in a way that they're actually easier to use than the current approaches that we have today for managing our identity, and then ultimately building upon that for to engage in like value transmission on the internet. And so, kind of, I would say that my biggest thoughts are sort of the old economists' adage is that incentives matter, and the best way to change the world is to change the incentives, and that's what I'm trying to do with my pursuit of these decentralizing technologies.
Cool. Thank you so much, Mike. Always a pleasure. We'll do this again soon, and hopefully folks can think deeply after this conversation. Be intentional.
Thank you so very much for the time, Trey.